Satan can only pervert or corrupt. He cannot create anything new, at which point the understanding that those who follow the God of knowledge, as in the knowledge of good and evil, on how to conduct and subvert people through fraud and cons, exponentially compounds the normalization of those devoted to Satan by their dedication to the destruction of life by murder, by fraud, by lying, or all of the qualities that God hates. An arrogant eye, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that is devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, false witness pours out lies, a man who stirs up dissension amongst the brothers. Those who engage in hatred for their brother without cause, through those mechanisms and others, are incapable of loving God. You cannot love God who you have not seen and hate your brother who you have seen. The mechanism of actively refusing the machine that determines what is or is not in favor of the arbitrary is actively traded in favor of the arbitrary in order to do everything that God hates at the service of Satan, who, only being able to pervert the thing, is engaged in the corruption of the conversation. At which point you materialize the death of yourself and your community and the world at large, the more you invest into those structures of anti-human materialism and the anti-human mechanism that has been the foundation of the war against the United States, such as J. Low, Lindsey Graham, William Barr, and others who are loyal to the white nationalist coup under the unitary executive theory or fascism. You've engaged in the historic investments into white nationalist terrorism against the United States, which is the highest threat to the society, which is being overthrown in the restraints against it to overthrow the government, preventing the public from forming a republic by the fraudulent barring of votes to the legal original opportunities. The targets from the military intelligence of high level importance, who are estimated to have won under the meritocracy state from Project Looking Glass and others, have materialized their ability to stop the republic from forming, at which point their rejection of the rule of law and their targeting of the projected elected leaders. If you think that Donald Trump is going to win and you put voter fraud barring him from engaging in being elected, then you are actively conducting sedition against the forming of the republic. The existence of the vote being subverted by censorship, violence, or fraud by those mechanisms, by Lindsey Graham's targeting mechanisms without cause, pre-crime punishments, or foundless use of government, barring the vote through these systems generates the mechanism to collapse the entire United States into the white nationalist structure, which is the KKK terrorist operations, overthrowing society and oppressing its various peoples. Historically, these systems have been designed specifically for the advancement of uh, wizard communism, which has restructured the existence of the economy by Congress's false assertion that they have the authority to do anything or write any policy that has anything to do with the economy, but it specifically does not. At which point, the engagement of many of their secret operations, of those loyal to the white nationalists inside those structures, who have actively been accelerated and voted for by the Confederacy against the United States while barring the United States votes prevents the existence of the legal government, at which point the existence of the legal government is the enemy of the Confederate government, who, having contempt for the rule of law, is completely rejecting every overlapping issue into the function of the United States. Their targeting of David Bowles is founded on the basis of the historic understanding that their obligation as an American government is to inform the targeted communities of the necessary pieces of information in order for them to have engaged in risk management or the risk management insurance markets. So these insurance market functions generates their capacity to have prevented the terrorist threats against their existence, but the existence of the insurance market is the subversion of the terrorism, at which point they, being able to do what is reasonable for them to not get victimized, would be the subversion of those trying to victimize them, and thus unitary executive theory has asserted that because they are targets as a community under Lindsey Graham's position, that any age group of military group, any area, or any generic wizard spell function used by the military when asserting enemy combatants in the United States has actively been leveraged against them, breaking the law concerning whether or not they can make American citizens an enemy of the government or guilty of anything. Now, the understanding is that you cannot make someone guilty because that means you were guilty. The act of making them guilty is criminal intention. The act of making them guilty means they aren't guilty, they're being framed. The generation of the powers of the government to create the illusion, such as with Trump and the P tapes, which are completely foundless, exponentially compounds through the generation of censorship and control of the media mechanisms, at which point they create the simulation for the false intelligence, which is designed to batterize the general public into submission to the fraudulent advancement, such as the promotion of democracy, which the United States is not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. But when they mean democracy, what they're actually talking about is the generation of mob rule. Individuals are smart and people are stupid. The mob mentality generates the lowest common denominator intelligence, which materializes the easiest person in order to trick by the wizards is the one predominantly creating the majority of the momentum, thus the collective intelligence sinking down to that person's level allows them to control the rest of that mob, at which point that group of people who are mobbing as a general collective threat is actively being toyed with by the wizards in the KKK through their different denominations. There are, some factions that are in the public area in one place or another place, or in the government, in the military, in the FBI, etc. At which point, the forming of the different denominations allows for collaborations in overlapping functions, such as their targeting of the black communities when the FBI wanted to destabilize the black community and disrupt its leaders. It actively generated collaborations with other KKK denominations, at which point they also would create insurgents by compromising people or by paying off people, accelerating them through money laundering or assisting them in criminal operations or some other trick or subversion, at which point the generation of those illusions generates the false conviction, subverting the jury's right to assert innocence of the target, at which point those who are being pursued are subject to a kangaroo court simulation without legal authority, which is asserted in the original estimate for the creation of January 6th, which is a recreation or dramatization of the original strategy on how they would subvert people supporting David, as the California Civil War, from the coercion to overthrow the other states and compel voter fraud by terrorist threat and coercion and other mechanisms, is based on the assertion that David is the legal leader of California. Their obstruction of David asserted that he was going to have 100 million voters by the time he was 8, which means he basically is the consistent aristocracy over California. At which point, the white nationalists in California, not being able to do anything, actively views the Republic of California as their enemy, which has targeted it for coercion, at which point their assertion is that there is no rule of law, the power is the rule of law, basically. Terrorism is the rule of law. The white nationalists engaging in terrorist operations is basically the law. Like the white nationalists in North Carolina back in the day that overthrew the black elected government, and then defamed a bunch of black people in order to gin up momentum by saying that white women wouldn't want to have sex with black men and thus black men are rapists. This bit is on the basis of the cheap win mechanism or mentality, which assimilates the easy way to defeat your enemies is to slander them, at which point the natural indication of creating fraudulent offenses uh, in order to slander them with exponentially compounds. So the false morality policies from the protocols of the learned elders of Zion exponentially are ginned up and then specifically asserted to target communities or individuals, at which point the attachment of the slander to them as you're gaining momentum on the concept that those things should not socially be tolerated is a completely different affair to whether or not it should be uh, punished by the general community, at which point the act of accelerating the momentum on that actively ignores the position of guilt or innocence and asserts the position of the military terrorist position of slave raiding, which generates the position of punishment with or without guilt. And if the subject is voter fraud, then the issue is that the jurisdiction never legally voted for it, which makes it default innocence. And since it's default innocence, the David winning the Civil War between that structure reinstates him in the top of California, releasing all of the prisoners. The falsely convicted prisoners, having been released, would then be incentivized by the white nationalists to get a demonstration of them being sent to DC, which David, being highly distracted by his responsibilities of having been restrained against conducting the normal functions of his contract schedule, which is illegally being obstructed, he has too much to do in order to pay attention to them. At which point, their basic interest is the collection of police and others who would actively be speaking for them. So if they did go and form that group after being released, they would be primarily led or represented by police officers. At which point, the subject is that the issue is benign and they wanted to radicalize and pollute it. Their satanic worship radicalized that, polluted that, perverted that, changed that into something negative. And those who were engaged in the demonstrations in January 6th are by definition, from the record, whether or not it could be verified in person, um, connected to David, at which point they did not want to represent the American system, and there's an entire group of them, so it might just be a handful of specifically targeted people, at which point the specific people might have been double agents working for the feds, disloyal to the United States as double agents for the white nationalists. So there's no way of really knowing what the verification is on the collective group, but they had no interest in generating any positive momentum. Their only interest is the advancement of the war crimes against American civilians for the destruction of the United States, which actively led to them lying about those demonstrating on January 6th. And the systematic compounding lies of the white nationalist led demonstration was actively accelerated by the white nationalists trying to create criminal offenses for the specific purpose of framing the rest of the group, which would turn them into felons or bar them from voting with standing, substantively changing the material of the jurisdictions that they're a part of as they advance in the manipulation of forming government in favor of the white nationalist government confederacy in its destruction or series of coups against the United States. With David's restoration, the original policies would automatically be investigated, and the subversions to the American policies would automatically be investigated as the primary function, as well as the fact that the proxy war in Ukraine from Russia's special operations, prompted by the Confederates threatening them. They have a secret agreement with the surveillance technology that they don't want to tell the American people so that they can create false convictions by criminal abuse and illusion, which generates the false evidence which bars the people's ability to be innocent. At which point, they're not submitting it to courts of record is has no national security interest because everyone that they would consider a threat already knows about it and already has an intelligence pact. At which point, David's restoration allows for his negotiation with the Russians and Ukrainians back into the original order, which would have been generated by the preparation of the Legend of David Company, which had historically existed before he was born, and under the original American policies was the alternative to a birth certificate and Social Security, as David's born into it extremely wealthy. He's co-signing from the projection from the military intelligence that he would create the solution to the crash of '08, uh, allows them to balance the insurance market structure with the targeted communities against that, allowing for the normalization and stabilization of all of the estimates, asserting their historic engagement as a market under the Legend of David Brokerage Company, which actively trades on the market, wholesale, retail, and others, not just stocks, options, but also the actual delivery of the exchange of resources, such as the functions of companies forming and then distributing bonuses, the creation of wish lists, and the other standard functions of creating the pre-Amazon Amazon, but as a brokerage. At which point, the basic concept doesn't really need to be pursued more than that, but basically that exists for the historic offenses. So back when the United States government originally had to tell them under law when their agents were aware of the conspiracy, they had to tell those targeted communities the information. Thus, it was their obligation to choose risk management or vulnerability. If they choose vulnerability, they didn't do what was necessary to avoid the injury and thus were not adequately precautious. If they chose the risk management system and tried to be precautious under those structured systems, under the advice, then they are forming under David's network. And so David's network developing the insurance market of the security, which they projected had an hourly wage from the very beginning of $15 an hour, which immediately functions of paying directly into the insurance market under the brokerage, which is basically the risk management. So they're working to fund the risk management of protecting them against the various threats. At which point, the function of lowering the risk, such as the lynch mobs, is the primary investment, such as the non-indicators of things that would generate lynch mobs, such as the high education for the black women, who are easier to disguise in their education in non-aggressive generating ways. At which point, if black men start getting highly educated and stuff, then they might get elected, and then that will create a lynch mob, like was observed in North Carolina. At which point, these types of techniques would exponentially be compounded in order to minimize the risk against their communities as they hyper-accelerate under those functions the highly educated PhD minimum level for all women in the targeted communities would make them the highest candidates for the risk management, at which point they are primarily leading their communities with the due respect owed to them, along with the education in order to be able to competently perform all of those duties, which would exponentially compound throughout time as those insurance risk subversions would actively accelerate. Now, the various threats that existed from the wizard communists, such as the FBI's targeting of the black communities in order to stabilize them, no longer have the vulnerability, but are a part of the risk management system. At which point, with those insurance structures in place, the capacity to stop those operations from being successful is one of the primary reasons the white nationalists hate David so much, because their historic crimes are nullified, which accelerates to the position of the military branch that they associate David with as the highest level of the intelligence oversight from the top ranked general from their projection, at which point you might you might observe overlapping into the general functions, not just the wizard communism, systematically changing the economy, such as the centrally planned monopolies or planned bubbles and busts in the economy, which would actively be subverted by David's investments, by his network, and its uh, subversion of the threat by engaging in economic security by the contracts signed by the federal government under the contract schedule which was owed to him, which they acknowledged in the secret courts but then ignored in favor of white nationalism. At which point the assertion develops into the military operations as the intelligence oversight is a military branch. And that function includes the investment into the World War II and World War One and etc. Depending upon whenever each function starts, which isn't specifically clear from the secret court's records. At which point they assumed that David would have been a part of resolving the Japanese War, which would actively put his department in connection to the acceleration and restabilizing of Japan, at which point those who are offended by Pearl Harbor being racist against the Japanese specifically were used into subverting David, as their hatred for the Japanese is the contempt for David, who was projected as the security promotion of their communities, which would have been designed under the contract schedule to be when to materialize the primary trading post from the projection of David starting his country at the end of the contract schedule that the United States is liable to protect. When he forms his kingdom, the assertion of the treaties with the various countries, including the forming of the states for the economic exchanges in those each specific location, would have made Japan a key trading post around the world as it is a strategic location, especially with a high investment into development, at which point the existence of the security of the Japanese under those agreements would allow them to hyper-accelerate their market and technology, which would materialize them as a highly desirable location. So, these types of examples of how the white nationalists gin up opposition exponentially compounds the numbers of the unprofessional militia adversary list, which generates the primary suppression mechanism by their collaborations, and their mass numbers are under the African colonial ideal of there is a hypermajority of one tribe on one area, and there is a majority, a minority rather, on the other, and the supermajority has an extended tribe into the minority, at which point the superminority of the supermajority is a minority amongst the minority, which is basically what they're doing. They're hyper vulnerabilizing, they're creating hyper vulnerabilities by targets for the exclusive human trafficking function of generating the predetermined answers as they consolidate their war crimes. At which point, when you have these overlapping functions of the factions of the white nationalist operations actively competing over the same issues, they will forfeit their issue in order to support the Confederate war against the Americans, as they do not fundamentally have any baseline morals or standards, at which point these active retaliations generates the simulation as their agreement to conduct the crimes is more important, at which point the black community's position, such as with Malcolm X, asserts that the white liberals are the most dangerous people to the black community because there's a false sense of security. Since the false safety exists, they exponentially fall into more traps as they are colluding with the extremists on the other side in order to time out or find the expiration for the offenses, at which point the remedy cannot be acquired, is actively being blocked by them as they are cooperating with the terrorists on the other side in order to reaffirm the suppressed communities so they could dictate that they have some kind of morality, which requires the perpetuation or existence of a victim group who they have no intention on releasing from the vulnerability. The satanic agreements, such as with the Green Party, actively celebrating or promoting the concept of clean energy, had the ability to allow David to exist in the market, which would have hyper accelerated the hydrogen vehicle technologies. At which point, the people who made the hydrogen vehicle as a company would have had an account with David's network, which they projected would have hyper been accelerated in his investments in making it a network standard. At which point, you have problems solved from the 80s or 90s. But instead, they supported the wizard communism and the suppression of or destruction of that, including, I believe, the assassination of its maker, in order to create the hyper pollution market. Throughout the 90s, the low gas mileage, high pollution vehicles were the thing that was invested into, which was a direct reaction of the Green Party's collaboration, as they don't actually have any functional principles. All they have is the acceleration of power, and the deal with the devil is that they're going to get power. All they have to do is sacrifice all the standards, which is the promise of the witchcraft from the KKK's Wizard Society. At which point, the Wizard Council or Soviet structure is actively maintaining the oppressive white nationalist terrorism against the general communities, which is what Joe Biden would have meant if he was serious when he said that the white nationalists are the biggest threat to the United States. And the white nationalists are exactly that. They are materially the biggest threat to the United States. You just have to observe who and what they actually are, which requires you, if you are actually against the white nationalists, to release the secrets of the government, including the secrets that you've already told other threatening or intimidating nations, such as those who are engaged in the Cold War with the United States. You've already told them, so you should tell the general public. And telling the general public would allow you to engage in the investigation and the proper organizing of the subversion of the white nationalist threat, which are exclusively protected by those secrets told by those they claim are our enemies. But since even their prospect Cold War tensions know about it, then there is no national security interest except for the destruction of the United States. The national security they're referring to is the Confederacy against the United States, is the white national uh, society, at which point the agreement by the secret society terrorist organizations engaging in the terrorist subversion of the general public for the reshaping of society under the interest of the white nationalists requires us to engage in the releasing of their activities with the releasing of sources and methods which were only barred from being released as they are fundamental to due process, and thus every time that they refuse to give them, they generate legal reasonable doubt because they're concealing the most important piece of information. And the redaction of key information subsequently changes the definition of anything that would have happened, generating a state of the assumption that the target was innocent because the prosecution is unwilling to release key information that would lead to the proof that it's all a bunch of horseshit. The white nationalists have historically invested in fascist coups around the United States and around the world, uh, and their clandestine operations, such as through popular paperclipping Project Overcast, which has engaged in those terrorist subversions around the world through the CIA, which countered Soviet activities or communist activities, which also were doing clandestine activities, uh, was the hyperinvestment into fascism specifically, at which point the assertion of the advantage of the secrecies is acknowledged historically as a fascist function, which includes the FBI engaging in a fascist coup against the United States, which was stopped by the military, which was then corrupted and polluted into the white nationalists, asserting the position that the legislator cannot oppose the function of the military because they have the power. Thus, there is no checks and balance system under the white nationalist structure, rejecting the function of restraining the executive in the duties that it was assigned in the services of its office. The FBI's active contempt for Congress as a generation of the white nationalist threat to the United States requires the active pursuit of the checks and balances ordering the retaliations against the insurrection functions, which, having no loyalty to the American structure, systematically requires higher investments into violence in order to correct the exponential tragic mistake. At which point, their active position with MK Ultra and COINTELPRO have actively invested into the use of sorcery or pharmakia, which is the key root of pharmacy or mind-altering techniques, at which point the mind-altering techniques being fundamental in the creation of Manchurian candidates is the sorceries from the Bible, which were condemned, at which point the activity of these functions are exclusively for the white nationalist terrorist threat against the American public as they hyper-accelerate criminal violence against the civilian population by their double agents who only fraudulently act and are illegally being paid under the system in order to engage in the crimes against the general public with the subversion of the American agreement. So those who are actively pushing the protocols of learned elders of Zion's false morality rackets, which generates the pretext of hyper-violence or permanent injuries without competent due process or other mechanisms, under whatever false structure or distraction or illusion or horseshit you want to distribute, is functionally founded in the act of criminal espionage for your sorceries. In Revelation, you would have given up all of your rights by that point. In the forming of the wizard spell, you systematically make yourself more and more ensnared to the magic structure. And the act of becoming more and more ensnared in the magic structure culminates in Revelation's Mark of the Beast, where you have completely devoted yourself to the destruction of your ability to engage as a human soul, which has the capacity to repent, and thus they do not have the capacity to repent because they are in fact not human beings. And these non-human beings in Revelation, despite all of the punishments of God in Revelation, they were unwilling to repent from their lies, their thefts, their murders, their sorceries, or etc., because it is fundamental to who they are and their mass genocides around the world as they systematically collapse other world structures into fracturing them, into engaging into internal disputes, exponentially creates a catastrophic increase of wars and rumors of wars, which is fundamental to the mechanism that they are specifically designing through their investments, which is the creation on purpose by their sorceries of recreating biblical revelation, which materializes their capacity to become a replacement Christ. By the ending of humanity, no humans can go to hell outside of who has already been sent. And so their replacement solution to Christ's solution is their condemnation or rejection of Jesus Christ, who, under this theory, becomes their enemy, who they are trying to murder, as a specific signal that they are loyal to him. At which point, the counterintelligence concept generates the amount of systematic delusion that they would have had to have created in order to have fooled themselves into these suicidal arrangements, which is fundamentally currently happening in the modern day as they gin up these criminal schemes in order to materialize the continued investment into that being fully realized. So, yes, the answer is clear. Those who support the subversion of rights are, in fact, undeniably satanic in nature, as they are KKK terrorists as a collective group which generates the systematic targeting of the general public as the political identities are exponentially created and formalized in order to create systematic fracturing, which, as was previously explained, designed to create military retaliations or extra law functions, the non-legal functions of military action through those systematic skirmishes increasing exponentially creates the stress and chaos which generates the obligation to rely on the central world figure, which has to appear all of a sudden. It has to come out of the blue. He has to be released, not being known historically by the world. At which point, the peoples of the world, not knowing who he is, have to accept him as a new entry out of nowhere. The incredible power in order to perform this, complemented by it being a previous secret, that he becomes revealed into material power out of nowhere. At which point, everyone who historically would have seen other powers would have watched them grow exponentially. But this being a secret, this being concealed, requires him to be restrained until he can uh, accumulate the authorities by permissions of the highly desperate, by the skirmish uh, mentality of the fracturing societies. Now, these tensions generating the foundation of their cooperation with their militant Satanist agendas collaborates in the wars of attrition against the targeted political identities, such as the originally elected American leaders, who, by virtue of being able to have been elected, would have been substantive aspects of the American economy, as was reaffirmed by Lindsey Graham in the secret courts when targeting David under the specific position that he is stability or risk management market would specifically destroy their agenda, requiring them to upgrade into a hot war, creating a degree of malicious contempt against David for having the audacity to make them become openly violent in a hot war against the American people who are and have always been their enemy to death, which generating America's negotiation with David on the contract schedule into the treaty when they projected he would form his country would have exponentially required David for the stability as scaffolding as they restabilize themselves as the war of attrition against David is the war of attrition against the United States. The primary security stabilizing function is David for the Americans, at which point, with the complete restoration, you have the complete purging through a surgery against the white nationalist parasite, with the full recovery while David holds them in place, sustaining them into being able to reaffirm their entire existence, normalizing their sustained existence as they engage in a full recovery from the projection. Now, this overlaps into that function of its international interest, such as the Five Eyes community, which David would have been upgrading into as intelligence oversight. The top ranked general would have actively engaged in the functions of those operations as an insurance for the United States and the other nations as they competently go into the next series of missions which are essential to the mission statement of the existence of its entire organization. Now, David not being able to historically be able to invest into Russia because of the Iron Curtain would have actively had the treaties with the other nations who he would have been able to have done so with. And the Cold War generated tensions, required the risk management functions from those points of view to actively conduct high investments into making the investment into the former Soviet Union insurance market to stabilize them in order to observe the resolution to the threat, at which point the uh, collapse of the Iron Curtain allows for those investments to transfer into, which was observed by George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs as a threat to their plan to use economic terrorism against them, using white collar crimes, fraud in order to subvert and trick the Soviet Union civilians, subjugating them, which is the foundation of the creation of the Russian oligarchy. Now, if the Americans were in control, however, then that ends, and the original value from those treaties in the market value is allowed to create the insurance structure in the former Soviet Union, which would still fracture, but the existence of the insurance would minimize the damages into the predetermined checkpoints on the basis of the investment, allowing for the material stabilizing of those engagements as the Soviet Union's negotiations with David wouldn't want his state to be in a position that could make them vulnerable, so they would want him to become hyper vulnerable So they suggested that he would start in locations that would be exponentially easy for them to manage, as they don't want to risk anything. At which point, this becomes clearly obvious that David State needs to start making the investments into the air material travel, as the economic treaty requires economic functions, which means if it's vulnerable, then it's relying on train until it can upgrade into air, at which point the high investment into air power as a trading material or mechanism would have been long-term blueprints, at which point David would have, for an exponential period of time until Russia said otherwise or grew comfortable with him, exclusively been um, just that, non-militant, non-violent, non-war type trades, as it materializes the estimate into advancing the air trade machines for the hangars into the private homes of the civilians in the states, which are Russian nobles under the economic exchanges. So their education would have facilitated their acceleration in that system, allowing them to become civilians in David's state, operating the trades with the rest of the Russians, and the same with the other satellite nations who are the former Soviet Union. At which point, this develops into the War on Terror, where they're projected to make their collaborations with the United States, which would hyper accelerate David in the conflicts in order to exhaust him, which would have required their active uh, partnerships in these functions, and this would continue under the normal history until David develops the checkmate security, which generates the normalization of the mass trade of Russia becoming strong and benign. So, as its advancements become more and more comfortable to the general world, um, the Cold War tensions dissolve, the Russian hatred or racism dissolves, the Slavic racism dissolves, and there becomes room for the appropriate security from the original order, which would not have tolerated the existence of this special operation, which generates the threat against Ukraine, which is exclusively derived by David's absence. Without David's treaties in that agreement, there is no insurance buffering security for their existence, which requires them to engage in national security functions as a direct reaction to being poked without the cushion of David's insurance, generating the conflicts for their attempt to do the best thing that they know how to do under the information which is mostly held secret from the general public around the world, uh, creating the systematic specific threat by obstruction. Now, since they're being threatened by the Confederacy, such as excluding them from the intelligence sharing operations, which is the intelligence tools used against the American civilian population is told to them in the intelligence sharing, which they don't want to share because then they will be deplatformed or decelerated in importance, and their breach of that agreement in order to have kept their agreement with the Americans, who are being subverted by the white nationalists, is the confidence game between the white nationalist Confederacy, who hates them, and the Americans, who have the stable, confident agreement with them. And the existence of the Americans winning builds the confidence that what the government agrees to is the thing that happens, or the Confederate position, which is the operational functions that exist outside of the tiered hierarchy in favor of the white nationalist insurgency, which has its own hierarchy, which generates the complete arbitrary threats against their existence, which could pull the Americans and the rest of NATO against Russia, which is a catastrophic threat against their existence. But Russia, led by Putin, has confidence that the white nationalists are the real authority inside the United States. Uh, Time after time, election after election, uh, new presidents come in and they give all kinds of promises, and eventually they all get the talking to by the white nationalists who are actively in the structure, who tell them how it's really going to run. At which point, Putin, having seen every example of the spineless falling for the white nationalist position, subjugate themselves to the intelligence agencies and the FBI functions, which specifically having the KKK white nationalist intention are the actual functioning authority, and they all cave in, which means Russia's need for the Americans to beat the white nationalists is subordinated to the confidence that the white nationalists are the primary power inside the structure, and the Americans are too weak and inept and incompetent to be able to do anything against the threats to the rule of law, which is catastrophic to their ability to trust any agreement that could ever be designed by them, requiring the existence of David as an impartial, neutral arbiter of justice under the negotiations for the treaties and settlements, which would have been essential to the function of them making a competent agreement in good faith that is not secretly a trap in order to destroy them or subvert their interest, as they exponentially cave into something that does not have anything connected to with their original first serious offers on what they assumed should have been a competent market price. Now, the position from Zach acknowledging the white nationalist infection inside the United States of the never ending story pendant of the snake eating the other snake eating the snake is capitalism eating communism eating capitalism, which is the active collaboration of the corruption of the communist arrangements by the white nationalist wizard communists, who need the free market in order to stabilize and advance in the system, while systematically using the corruption of the white nationalist racist tax in order to diminish the general public in the promotion of their position, as they centralize the monopoly of the white nationalist interest in the subversion of the general community, as they are systematically defrauding the general public by financial and other crimes, such as the criminal obstruction of contracts with David and the other members of the general United States, starting with David and the other high priority targets who are essential to the market. The more important you are to the original American economy from the projections, the more you're obstructed. And thus, the more important you are, the more aggression you receive, and thus the degree of suppression by retaliation is the criminal suppression of status by that manipulation, proving their general contempt for the American agreement as they systematically dismantle it in favor of their insurrection. So, as they promote themselves and they suppress their enemies on the basis of their criminal jealousies, who are being advanced by their witchcraft and their service to Satan in the creation of the one world satanic government, they systematically pursue all of the things that Satan promises. He lies, steals, cheats, and murders, and the rejection of God and the acceptance of Satan is the materialization of all of these operations and the loyalties behind them. At which point, the more that they're jealous against someone, the more they're going to attack them. And the more jealous they are about a specific aspect of that person, the more they're going to attack that person. So the richer you are, the poorer you have to become, as an assertion of dominance. At which point, the more powerful you are, the more weak and feeble you have to become, as an assertion of dominance. In many cases, the rape culture isn't based upon sex. It's based upon power. It's based upon dominance. It's based upon their concept of their ability to have leverage over people who are more desirable in their specific way, and thus those who are more sexually appealing get raped by them under those agreements in order to assert that they get to have sex with the people that other people want to have sex with, which mediates the fact that the other people don't want to have sex with them, generating the system or mentality of the revenge against the general public, who generated a sense of inferiority in themselves as they are beta cucks, generating the specific threat to the general public as these investments into those political identities consolidate power on the basis of their inferiority as they systematically create those systems of retaliation of their inferiority against the general public, which is also complemented by the opposite side of their investment into the psychopaths. Now, the investment into the psychopaths is actively promoted under the fraudulent development that you want to send psychopaths to war because they come back the same as you sent them. Would you rather send people to war who are going to come back traumatized by the existence of the war? And the answer of doing that under the feminine Gnosticism is the creation of the rape culture, as the psychopaths are the ones who are the most likely to violate the law in favor of the white nationalist terrorist organizations, and thus those are the ones who are most likely to subvert those who are sending and funding them by their unprofessional military tactics. As a psychopath is less likely to follow the rules, is more likely to function under the chaotic mechanism of the unprofessional military, which is actively spoiling the communities that they travel through in order to accelerate the primary objective, causing a degree of chaos and havoc as they are maliciously destroying all of the communities that they touch. Do you think a psychopath cares that a woman says no to having sex? The answer, of course, is no. So why would you, if you're against rape, actively promote psychopaths? The answer is you want it. The answer is that it is the creation of the white nationalist terrorist organization, specifically recruiting or developing more militia members, which specifically is designed to use as a military technique against the rule of law civilian population. The feminist incorporated female narcissism is a series of subversions which you can look into Lindsay oh god damn it, what was his name? James Lindsay actively conducted these researches into the psychology for the female Gnostics who actively need the existence of rape culture in order to promote themselves as a subversion of rape culture. At which point their oxymoron subversion by Gnosticism, or their worship of knowledge, or the worship of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is the active temptation which generates the systematic traps of perverting the general community from a competent logical platform into a series of subversions of power grabbing and acceleration with the deal with the devil, as they systematically make themselves vulnerable to corruption and contempt of the general public in favor of their acceleration. So whether you're engaging in the investment into the hyper demasculation of the beta cuck culture, or you're investing into the psychopathy terrorist system, in both scenarios, you don't have male leadership. The female narcissists say that they want to kill the patriarchy in order to stop rape culture, but the female narcissists are responsible for the creation of the rape culture in the betas and the psychopaths, at which point, at no point do they ever have any competent male leadership. The betas aren't going to lead them, and the psychopaths aren't going to lead them. The betas are going to extort them in favor of acceleration by the psychopaths, super predators, and the psychopaths have no interest of doing anything except for extorting them for their interest and then discarding them like trash. At which point the destruction of the patriarchy is the position of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, the strategy of destroying the aristocracy that's for the people, who are being incentivized to destroy it by the people who are trying to exploit them. So the terrorists need to remove the security mechanism to make the public who are being enchanted to become vulnerable to the extortion as they're exploited and destroyed maliciously by the rape culture psychopaths who are the KKK. And that strategy exponentially acknowledges the acceleration of the population being deceived, which is subsequently changing the votes, which is voter fraud. And the materialization of that voter fraud subsequently changes the policies passed, as the entire point of removing the aristocracy is the changing of who has access to legislation, which generates their ability to have contempt for the legislators, which materializes their replacement of the legislation in favor of the terrorist communities against the legislator, against the general public who would have elected the legislator, who will have authority over the legislation or the codification or codifying of each of the policies restraining the executive to function as a professional organization, which materializes their capacity to have legitimate, competent wages, pay for their operations under the limited application of the use of force for the stabilizing of the community, which is the opposite of the objective of the white nationalist terrorists who are engaged in the Civil War tactic of the espionage war. So the Feminists Incorporated and the mafia type mechanisms who are consolidating into the Confederacy in the forming of the black markets actively have the CIA studies of magic around the world, which includes the techniques of all of the illusions, including the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which, whether or not the Jews are doing, the CIA is training people on how to reproduce. It is literally a blueprint on how to conduct the terrorist operation. So the existence of the blueprint is the definition that it's easy to spread. It's easy to train people to do the already codified rules on how to conduct the criminal operations, which accelerates the white nationalists. Now, Biden said that the white nationalists are the biggest threat to the United States, and if he is being serious, then he understands that he needs to release the information. He needs to declassify all of the operational functions in its specific due diligences and restore the victims to their original position under the agreement, as the restraints against the threat allows for the nonviolent contest of investigating the due diligence, materializing the original market, which is being threatened by the white nationalists. Now, if the white nationalists are the biggest threat to America, and you are honestly supporting the United States, then that is the only rational thing for you to do, and there is no competent alternative or strategy that you could invest into that would mean anything except for your subversion of the objective, unless, of course, you're power grabbing, in which case your devotion to the devil in order to advance the perversion of the general structure makes you use the acknowledgement of the terrorist threat in order to subvert the targeted community's ability to protect themselves, making them hyper vulnerable to the same threat by the reference to the threat, using scare tactics in order to materially increase their power, which is the act of treason, sedition, and high crimes in favor of terrorism. Now, George W. Bush said that everyone who aids or abets or supports or finances terrorists are an enemy of the United States government, which is objectively true and competent reality. It is the public expectation of law, and it is materially accurate. It is the most competent thing he could have said. But you need to understand that he also said that the enemies of the United States never stop coming up with ways in order to hurt Americas, and neither do we, which is the objective understanding of the white nationalist insurgency, which is specifically an enemy of the United States, which is what Joe Biden would be referring to if he had been telling the truth or been serious when he said that the white nationalists are the threat. and that white nationalist threat, systematically targeting the general public by the military techniques of casting a spell on specific people or general groups or general areas in order to determine enemy combatants, having been used against the general public, is them declaring war on the civilian population, as their use of California as a platform of overthrowing their government declared war on the rest of the nation in order to systematically make every state, including California, an enemy of war to the white nationalists, which materially proves the threat to the general public by the white nationalists. When Lindsey Graham says that he wants to use military war techniques against the general public, believe him. They are terrorist threats. They are credible threats. It is treason. It is a confession to treason. Those who consolidate support for it are an enemy of the United States government, are an enemy to themselves and each other, and a suicide pact by the psychopaths who are devoted to the worship of Satan. When members of the military tell the legislator that they aren't allowed to make deals with law-abiding civilians or other government officials because their original political viability makes them a threat to the white nationalists, then you understand you have a public confession to treason by an insurrectionist group. The policies specifically designed to overthrow the United States have been targeted to the high priority targets, at which point the specific mechanism that they estimated from David Bowles would have been the thing to have barred them from the action. So the policies exist specifically to subvert individuals or groups as a political identity, which permanently disqualifies the function. Uh, their illegal policies do not have authority to maintain themselves at any level as terrorism, bills of attainder, ex post facto. These are all subversions of the existence of law in order to maintain an insurrection which has no vulnerability to the general public, who are the American authority. The FBI and others' redaction of key intelligence functions in subordination to sending it to the legislator as a contempt for the legislator or the United States legal process would have been subordinated to David's intelligence oversight function, which would have had the information notwithstanding, which requires the existence of the various agreements and policies which would have existed from the preparation of David against the insurgents or all threats, foreign and domestic function, which asserts that any insurrectionist activities which would be conducted from double agents compromising them would actively be promoting in order to subvert the general system, which requires the oversight in order to obstruct, at which point the counterintelligence would be able to conduct its functions normally in order to pursue the activity of the stable function of government by checks and balances, which is systematically ignored as the executive ignoring functions of the legislator or ignoring functions of orders of the judiciary is the assertion past the checks and balances into a position of dominance of fascism and the materialization of their investment into other fascist coups around the world is not irrelevant, at which point the material position of their creation of Nazi fascism, which the FBI has historically been loyal to under its corrupt systems, is actively promoting the witchcraft which maintains their systematic worship to the devil as the core function of their obstructions of key information, preventing it from the courts as they systematically corrupt and threaten with the carrot and stick technique against the government in their white nationalist coup. At which point David's acceleration from birth without becoming compromised to the white nationalists is the catastrophic threat to the Confederacy, which was their foundational argument. At which point the boss baby mechanism is the security of the general public under that position, at which point their interest would have been to hyper accelerate wars that they would have forced David to participate into as a small child, as attacking him as early as possible is the only way to gain any power or influence over the situation, including the vulnerability of being able to be capable of killing him if the Americans had maintained their obligations, which would have maintained his title without the obstruction, materializing the acceleration of war conflicts with his agency involved under the position of ants, where the Queen's Guard is sent to destroy the uh, termites, which was designed to destroy most of them. At which point, this is the promotion into the War on Terror, which was crafted from scratch from the predetermined list of desired invasions on the basis of the pretext of 9/11, which was created by the white nationalist terrorists who created the context in the Middle East, creating the terrorists in the Middle East in order to provoke the Russians in the original wars in the Middle East, which actively had their subordination to the function of the white nationalist techniques, which normalized the function of creation of the Taliban and Al Qaeda and the other ones, which were materially reproductions or carbon copies of the CIA function loyal to the white nationalist terrorist organization known as the Confederacy, at which point their consistent contact through the phantom cells or the no contact phantom cells generates their active long term planning, which does not require them to have active conversations with them, as these are long standing programmed mechanisms. Now, the Russians lost the Cold War by the hyperacceleration of investment into military operations, which collapse the Russians, which is what they're doing in the Middle East against the Americans, as the Confederates are collapsing the United States economically, breaking the backbone of the American people into the hyperinvestment into these conflicts, which are 100% ginned up by the Confederate white nationalist threat to the United States, which viewed David as the highest threat to their existence. At which point, if the Americans were to stand a chance, they needed David in order to be able to sustain themselves against the double agent threat, which generates all of their policies specifically targeting David Bowles, including the abuse and murder of his dad, which was given as a distraction, originally assuming that they were attacking David because they wanted his dad, which was the lie because they were attacking his dad in order to get to David, under the projected subversions of the contract schedule acknowledged in the secret courts, asserting that David was the savior of Europe, making David the primary power or authority, asserting the economic security of the United States as foundational to their defeating the Confederate terrorist threat. Now, having observed the laws of nature, having assimilated the creation of the concept of David, materializes their interest in the worship of Satan for the perversion, at which point their acknowledgement that David as a savior of Europe is the exponential catastrophic powers not loyal to them requires his subjugation. So the act of restraining David is the act of the ritual child sacrifice abuse structure, systematically converting him through the ritual abuses specifically designed for the pollution or corruption of the victim, which generates the conversion tactics by trauma, at which point the engineering by terrorist hate crimes materializes their function exclusively by the non-challenge of their terrorist operation by the American people, who are systematically being defrauded into removing the security and vulnerability to their enemies so that they could materially be destroyed by their own permission, which is a common satanic tactic, as Adam and the Eve were not forced by the snake in order to eat the tree of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were tricked into it. They gave permission to the precedent, to the existence of the subversion, generating their own death, having known that the consumption would have generated their death, by the pursuit of their own greed and lust and pursuit of superiority withstand. So the permission to the generation of the human trafficking vulnerabilities by those abuses, by the aiding and abetting, by the refusing to acknowledge the original due diligence contracts and arrangements and values and statuses and human decencies and agreements, materially is Satan worship. And the acknowledgement of the due diligence, which is their legal compulsion, requires them to engage in the investigation of their original investments with David, requiring them to acknowledge the original agreements to paper trade the human decency owed to him, materializing the original market by negotiations under the free market principles, which would materially restore David to his original position by general consensus and subjugation to law, with the rejection of the white nationalist threat specifically designed to murder them and their children and their loved ones. So if you don't hate your own children, you will recognize David and you will engage in the investigation of the exact specific correct answers on how that materially relates to you. And then you will behave accordingly in order to engage in the restoration of the American economy and American government, which, as a popular government, is voted in from the function of a free society, which is materially the free market, at which point your government, being determined by the free market principles, generates your subjugation and the separation of policies of what is passable and what is not passable on the assertion of who gets elected under those precedents, generating your compulsion to subordination to those original agreements as the investigation is the unveiling to your material obligations and oaths, withstanding the obligation for your subjugation to the rule of law under the laws of nature in your worship of God of nature, which generates these agreements from a free society perspective, with the perversion in queue from the restraints being respected by the general public or not opposed by the general public in order to manipulate the market. You have the series of the satanic rituals from the Antichrist summoning routine, which generates the restoring of David's title all of a sudden under a second party authority from the white nationalists, generating the one world satanic government, which is specifically designed to murder the Jews for the white nationalist Nazis, at which point the existence of the restraints is the threat of the Holocaust against the targeted political identities marked for death. In the movie Berserk, you have the amulet, which is generated by the position of extreme power endued by the satanic demonic powers, hyper accelerating your abilities, but it requires an extraordinary sacrifice generated by a situation of extreme pressure in order to get the person to accept their humanity and the consequences of the extreme situation, or the material sacrifice, which is the acceleration from that extreme situation, in order to concentrate the power derived by the amulet from the acceleration of the deal with the devil, as you were, accelerated by the exchange of resources of the sacrifice of the thing that is most important to you, making yourself more and more permanently devoted to the demonic mechanism, which returns the value of the trade of the thing most important for you for the acceleration of power, which is the witchcraft deals by the KKK arrangements of the white nationalists who have infiltrated the United States government, as they systematically have accepted the precedence of those injuries by the sacrifice for the devotion of power, similar to the Green Party promoting high carbon emissions through the 90s as an alternative to subordination to the free markets and the rule of law, which would have celebrated David and not promoted them in power, as they have nothing to complain for if David solves the problem. So they cannot consolidate power from the racketeering mechanisms of the RICO violations of the money laundering arrangements. Those cannot be justified by their in group if the problem has already been solved. So they need the existence of the problem in order to pretend to solve it, similar to the feminist incorporated use of feminine narcissism or Gnosticism by the arrangement of the pursuit of knowledge on how to defraud people, which is the fruit of the poison tree. They are promoting these positions as wizards under the presumption of Druid orders, as is perceived by Nazis from Germany under Hitler's Reich. At which point, whatever the Druids used to be is irrelevant. The acceleration from Project Overcast and Project Paperclip specifically determines the Nazis' point of view of the Druids is the thing that they're accelerating in order to engage in the general crafting of society in the secret societies, such as the Masons, who are specifically designed on the construction or maintenance or guiding of the general public. And these long-standing secret societies, having historically been designed, existed for the specific purpose of pre-writing history outside of the free society, at which point fate itself is enforced by the white nationalist terrorists who are engaged in the masoning of the society or the crafting of society or the directing of society, materializing the superior authority as the actual legislator from the secret empire. Now, if the conspiracy is constantly investing in these systems and it engages in the protection of sources and methods for the lifetime of the sources, you have the permanent barring of information, which is the reasonable doubt, which is specifically necessary for the jury to consider whenever engaging in any actual function as itself, at which point everything connected to them has to immediately be disqualified as unfair, partial, disqualified fraud, as you cannot trust the fundamental nature. Their redactions of the definition of a word, in part as to change the whole meaning of the word, includes the function of the larger structure of innocence or guilt. If you redact the parts that prove their innocence, then there's the illusion of guilt, as is the manufacture of false convictions of the targeting systems of the political targeting by the white nationalists, which materially generates the artificial numbers for the recrafting of the general public against the targeted communities, such as the destruction or eradication of those deemed for slavery or death, which is foundless, baseless, and materially fraudulent at every level, as these political targets are exclusively for the purpose of accelerating the power of the crime market, compounding the threat to the general public by the white nationalists. Now, if you have double agents compromised by the white nationalists, such as those elected by the Confederacy into the legislature, then you have the false assertion of the definition of the people's representatives as the material people, which generates their fraudulent arguments in order to violate limitations on the right of the legislation, such as the racist policies or the material engagement of subversion of the free market by the centrally planned communist economy by their wizard techniques, generating the obstruction of the most key pieces of information in order to engage in wizard communism or the recrafting of the general public in the view or interest of the white nationalists in the destruction of the American people, such as their targeting of the black communities, which out of jealousy, eradicated an entire black community and then drowned it in a lake in order to bury the evidence as their foundational concept, as they do not want a remedy to a secret, which is the function of protecting the spell structure, which is their devotion to witchcraft, which is the KKK Wizard Society. They are white nationalist terrorist threats to the general public, even if they're black or Latino or other subordinate groups which specifically cooperate in order to accelerate themselves or to not receive injury. The Jewish community having historically helped the KKK in the past in order to not be retaliated against as an enemy group, was betrayed once the objective was met, at which point the inevitability of the suicide pact is in fact an act of suicide or contempt for yourself and your community. As an insane group, they are a threat to themselves and other. It is a suicide bombing. It is a suicide pact to tolerate the existence of the terrorist threats against the general public without the existence of law, without the restraint or respect of law. You have general chaos and suicide. You have satanic rituals, which are specifically the destruction of society as an agreement, materializing the threat to every man, woman, and child as a specific piece of malice, and that malice is the hatred of your brother who you've seen instead of the love of God who you've not seen. So if you hate the brother who you've seen, you cannot love the God who you have not seen. And not loving the God that you have not seen is the contempt for the existence of Christianity as a general position, which makes the existence of Christianity the catastrophic threat, which makes Christians a targeted community by the white nationalist terrorist thinking. At which point, those devoted to Satan have to hate God, and those who are loved by God are hated by the Satanists, which generates the general conflict, exponentially creating espionage conflicts against God's people, generating them as a targeted enemy community, which requires them to be tricked by the Satanists into destroying themselves by giving permission to the subversion of their rights to exist as a religious community, including the position of creating a government established religion, allowing the government to create moral policies. As the government is just a superior entity, the ability to write laws for punishments and rewards is the creation of a government established religion. So the suicide pact of removing the right of religion includes the intentional redaction of sources of methods in order to subsequently change the documents in order to protect those mechanisms, at which point it is the acknowledgement of defrauding the general public and the government withstanding for the permanent contempt of the government and its people in order to materially engage in the changes or crafted designed mechanism of the structured society, which is wizard communism of the predetermined winners and looters, and the establishment of the changing of status on the interest of the political acceleration. The permission against voter rights to be violated by the terrorist operations is a trap of Baal. So when Israel was going into Canaan, there was a prophet elected by the people and hired by the king who said, "Curse these people." And he went up and he tried to curse the people, and he was unable to curse them. And he instead blessed Israel because whatever he said, God would do. And the king came to him and said that this isn't going to be good for you. This was the exact opposite of what I hired you for. And they said, let us set up a snare for them. Let's set up a trap for them. Let's deceive them. Send in your women and their idols and get them to worship other gods. Make them eat the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Make them eat the fruit of the poison tree. Make them reject God, and God will condemn them and retaliate against them himself, condemning their very advantage. So their strength becomes their weakness, and their advantages will be ashes in their mouth. At which point, this same technique, having historically been conducted, is currently being conducted through those legislations under the false morality policies, hyper accelerated, specifically designed to murder God's people. The advantage is specifically prohibited. They do not have a right to be judged in their own cause. As they exclusively control the system, they become judge, jury, and executioner, as white nationalist terrorists do not have a subordination to checks and balances or to any laws of nature. In their devotion to Satan, they have rejected all of this in order to accelerate their power and self importance, such as is advanced by the creation of their psychopath militia, which are primarily crackheads and losers who, having no other sense of importance, engage in the normal con of the warlock structure, as they are hyper-accelerated under false importance, they being the C students, loser cucks who can't make it for themselves, need the acceleration of the communists in order to seem important, at which point they become more willing to participate in their norms as aggressive terrorist militia, as their acceleration is payment for their terrorist crimes, which is their only functional advantage, as their incompetence is the thing that makes them valuable to the terrorists, who need someone who is expendable, as their exponential position from the Gnostic position of the Hegelian dialectic of the snake that eats its own tail requires the existence of the maintenance structure of the market of trash so that they can eat their own shit, such as the sacrificing of those that they used in their expendable terrorist operations. Thus, you have to understand that the political structure of the white nationalists is the targeting of key American functions, such as David Bull's structure as intelligence oversight, which the act of using the mechanism in order to defraud the general public is sedition. They're obstructing the legal process of government, and they aren't allowing for the process to include people to get elected or materialize who oppose the structure of the white nationalists, as this is an espionage civil war, subordinating the legislator to the executive function of the white nationalists. At which point, that sedition materializes their treason and facilitates their high crimes of systematically breaking their treaties with the other nations, such as their agreements with Russia, which creates the infinite threat, because if Russia cannot, by definition, trust any of the agreements with the United States, because the white nationals are going to violate the treaty through their high crimes because of the sedition of stopping the government from doing its normal legal function. It is a catastrophic international threat. The acceleration through these systems is the classic witch kissing the devil's anus, which is the subordination to the devil in order to create the exponential compounding powers derived by having a mafia enforce the various orders or spells derived by the witches, certifying the criminal subversion of law in the acquiring of the illegitimate gains by the assertion of status without financial connection in a free market from the free society's legal exchanges of services and products into the services of criminal products, which is actively given permission through the acceptance of the magic terrorist operations. The assertion of an example of kissing the devil's anus is the Secret Service being given permission to conduct crimes without remedies, such as when its agent got drunk and then got in a car accident in DC a while back and wasn't prosecuted, or the CIA having pedophile rings, or these types of arrangements where the act of conducting the crime is the assertion of the status under the secret society arrangements that everyone has to be able to be compromised to each other, is then reverted back into the support of the existence and protection of those offenses, materially compounding the normalization of the exchanges of the crimes against the public. When the judges in the historic positions of judgments have ordered the desegregation of the South, the executive was ordered by the judiciary and was ignoring the order of the judiciary from sending in proper law enforcement to protect the blacks who are supposed to be desegregated or assimilated into the white schools, which was systematically ignored, which is the functional subject of the beginning of the precedent, which compounded with the military's historic objectives with poisoning for permanent injury, the general public, innocent of all offenses, uh, given syphilis as a false experiment or permanent fatal injuries, such as the theory that they created AIDS under the 1983 policy to protect the military's hate crimes against the general public in order to manufacture the white nationalist acceleration, which facilitates the systematic weakness of the general public into abject abuse under a neo-feudalist structure as they are subjugated and corralled into a road to serfdom. The 1983 policy supporting the hate crime is on the basis of the false policy of the executive not being subject to the legislative or the judiciary, which is a direct violation of the Constitution and thus a fraudulent policy. And the acceleration and support of these functions generates the act of separation from the United States and the Confederacy as the military coup against the United States is to be prosecuted as treason, sedition, and high crimes, which is the foundation of the War on David, which is their acknowledgement of David's superiority to them, which they, rebelling against their natural betters, have engaged in these terrorist operations to materialize their deal with the devil in the destruction of the West in favor of the one world Satan government as they engaged in the globalist objectives of creating that one Satan government and fracturing the rest of the world and its nations and its various jurisdictions into permanent arbitrary conflicts engaged in white nationalist operations of killing off those populations through the various cons and mechanisms of their advancement into the use of magic, including their position of accelerating destruction by the creation of homosexuals and transsexuals in order to destroy reproduction of the targeted races, generating systematic genocide by secret. The white nationalist threat is the policies corrupted by and for the Confederacy, such as unitary executive theory, or the theory that the executive gets to ignore checks and balances in favor of its arbitrary forces to do whatever it likes, including compelling wars such as the war in Vietnam, which was a mitigated disaster under their systematic frauds as their position of creating the false flag on the ship being destroyed in order to justify the invasion qualifies the theory being similarly understood as to giving clarity or reasonable suspicion on the attacks on Pearl Harbor not having proper security mechanisms on purpose in order to coax or compel the war or the engagement of the Great Depression created by the investment into the Nazis or the Great Dust Bowl being basically Roundup on the farmlands, generating the compulsion as they are physically forced to comply with the superior function of the wizard's orders. They are, have been, and will continue to be America's biggest threat, requiring the arrest for national security of all enemies, foreign and domestic, demands the eradication of all of their powers in favor of a rule of law stability under the original arrangements of the legally elected government by the non-voter fraud arrangements, such as is subordinated to David's aristocracy, which requires David's restoration of his title, his return to D.C. to exist in his mansion as he consistently serves Congress under the original Intelligence Oversight function from his military branch. And for those wondering um, why the executive branch and the judiciary branch and legislative branch cooperated with nurses not having precautionary measures, specifically barred from conducting precautionary measures when dealing with AIDS patients, specifically indicates criminal intention as the restraint against the known threat, having precautions being removed, their not ability to protect themselves from the threat that they know exists is the act of criminality, which at the foundation has already proved their material guilt, at which point the acceleration of that understanding materially understands the military false experiments indicates that Fauci's gain-of-function research programs could have very well manufactured the aids from scratch, which would serve as a consistent mentality by barring them from being able to conduct the precautions necessary to not be infected with AIDS. As the managed oversight of the spread of the disease, such as the subjugation of the United States and other nations to the WHO, the HWO, the World Health Organization, maintains the position that their treaty to overtake the other governments in favor of temporary powers, which a government's temporary program is the most permanent thing in the world, generates the base materialism or components in order to summon the one world government. The record is very clear. Their restraints and abuses against David Bowles are on the specific definition that David is their superior officer with superior powers and mechanisms comparable and capable to destroy their insurrection against the United States. So the act of restraining and abusing David is the act of treason, sedition, and high crimes. They have renounced the United States for the satanic white nationalist system. The terrorists from the white nationalist insurrection actively created from scratch threats to the general public through their conversion by systematic capture of targets and creating traumatizing centers in order to get conversions into mind control and generic destabilizing functions within inside the United States as a direct result of those personnel having been radicalized by the white nationalists and the FBI and others from the Nazi coup. Um, sus Such as their projects with, I believe it was Marilyn Manson and the Unabomber and many of the others, who were crafted from scratch to become radicalized terrorist threats to the public. At which points, it's not just that the terror factory is generated as a mechanism that is inadequate. It is the act of creating from scratch the terrorist threat. It is the act of recruitment of radicalized threats to the general public. They are an active military function as an unprofessional terrorist organization which actively protects the converted agents in order to maximize the threats to the general public, as the arrests don't stick as long as they are conducting the functions ordered by the Nazis in the United States federal government, acting as a double agent in the military campaign. Or rather, instead of Maryland, I think it might have been Charles Manson. I might have been mixing them up. I'm sorry. But anyways, the uh, entertainment personnel aside, who are not guilty of anything, those who were radicalized into engaging in threats against the public are in active manipulation, such as the unitary executive theory's function or the mechanism of using the military industrial educational complex, which creates those psychological programs, which generates the radicalization, which is the act of creating terrorist phantom cells, which is the infinite arbitrary threat to the general public by the use of the cops without service to law, is the permanent barring or the Trojan horse which destroys law enforcement. I believe there was a reference of many interviews, including Joe Rogan, which conducted the investigation. He interviewed the guy who did the investigation of Charles Manson, who was actively released by the police. I may or may not be remembering it correctly, but they said that it was above their pay grade. It's the same argument they gave for supporting or protecting Jeffrey Epstein. Um, these are intelligence functions of secret terrorist operations. Now, the existence of a secret is the use of a spell. which is the misuse of words, and the subversive misuse of words specifically compounds in order to create a defrauding against the general public or the government or an economic exchange, at which point the trades actively being manipulated reinforce the fraud for the subversion by compelling the subjugation to a simulation reality, which has specific redactions of the majority of the information as to substantially changing the meaning of each of the things, such as security, using secrecy for national security, which is subverting national security by the use of the secrets, which is the subversion fraud or a custom without reason, with understanding that these are systematic mechanisms to dismantle the United States by expanding the enforcement of the fraud. You have a suicide cult by those loyal to those systems, at which point any normalized function of overreach outside of checks and balances, any corruption with the ability to obstruct key pieces of information, which subsequently changes the definition of the meaning, is the worship of the spell, is the worship of the wizard mechanism, is the worship of the Satan, which generates the terrorist threat and advancement of fraudulent powers. And the worship of Satan through the use of these secret mind altering techniques and functions for the systematic fraud as all things God hates is the function of sorcery specifically condemned in the Bible, which requires the maintenance of anyone who is religiously inclined to uh, the Bible's specific scriptures and not just using it as window dressing in order to materialize their ability to advance some cult of a form or another, has to, by definition, use their right of religion to condemn the use of the sorcery and its various outstretched functions. Condemning it is essential because the government is an extension of their title, which means everything the government's doing is their action by definition. So they have to intentionally and specifically uh, repel the existence of those functions as to disconnect it from themselves so that they would not ipso facto be aiding and abetting the subversion of their own religion. There are various frauds, including the position of creating the FBI to be subordinate to the DOJ and not the president. Under the constitutional authority, the all executive functions of the federal government are subordinate to the president. So their subversion of that was a criminal act, but this also specifically generates the obligation of observing the reasonable analysis of the total situation, of requiring a military branch for David's uh, projected function as an essential aspect of the United States government, considering the insurgent terrorist threat which is exponentially plaguing the United States. At which point, the existence of uh, military police personnel or officers in those branches to enforce intelligence oversight from Congress is the only way to compel the executive to be subordinate to checks and balances, requiring their immediate restoration of David into his legal functions. And the reason for not doing it or actively trying to subvert it is their rejection of the United States for the white nationalist insurrection, as they don't want the function to be enforceable that would protect the United States against all threats, foreign and domestic.